Hi, everybody. Welcome to Noble Company Podcast. My name is Roanne Smith. And for those of you who've never watched our podcast before, this is a podcast that looks at contemporary business topics, and we speak with professionals, academics, entrepreneurs from across the world. Now, you haven't seen me for a while. I have been super busy, but I'm really excited to be back with you today. And as most of you would know, because every year in May we look at mental health. We celebrate Mental Health Month. So it's always my pleasure, because it's a topic that I'm really passionate about, to bring a discussion surrounding mental health to you. Now, this week we have two persons that are joining us. One you're very familiar with because he's always here. And the other one is his colleague who is new to us. So let me start by introducing our newbie, Maya Kellman. Hi, Maya. Welcome.
Hi, Roanne. Thanks for having me and thanks for hosting me. Hi, everyone who's logged in.
Thank you. And Dwayne Devonish.
Hi, Ron, and hi, Maya, and to your audience.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start by asking you to just do a brief introduction of yourself. Like everybody has, most persons would have looked at your bio before coming online. And if they haven't, you can always check it out on my LinkedIn page. But I am going to start with Maya, ladies first. If you would just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yes, my name is Maya Kellman, as I said before, and I am a qualified attorney here in Barbados, having been called to our local bar association in the year 2019. Through that time and now, I have done a lot of advanced training within the corporate law, occupational health and safety, leading organizational change. I do have certificates from the Institution of the UK, and also leading organizational change from Cornell University in the States. Apart from my legal acumen, I have developed myself into an organizational development consultant, and I had the opportunity to found MLK Legal and Consultancy. And with that, it doesn't only offer contractual services and civil services, but it also focuses on the helping organizations within the public sector and the private sector develop their policies and involve in training and so on. So I'm happy again to be here, and that's just a bit about me professionally.
Well, thank you so much, Dwayne.
Yes, so I work as a full-time professor in management and organizational behavior at the University of the West Indies, Scapefield campus. And I teach courses such as business strategy, organizational behavior, introduction to management, even research methods. Uh, Professionally, I consult with private and public sector entities surrounding a range of subjects from mental health, job related stress, strategic planning, organizational development, to name a few. And I'm deeply passionate about these subjects, and I continue to leverage my ability to educate in this regard. So I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing that with us. And just for our audience, um, for those of you who aren't used to being with us, we like to have a very lively discussion. So feel free to reach out with any questions, any comments. We want to hear from you. The first thing I'm going to start with is what is the psychological contract? Now, we are accustomed to hearing about legal contracts. We know about work contracts, but psychological contracts, for many people, that's kind of a new thing. So, can you just give me a synopsis of what that is and how it differs from a regular professional contract, work contract? Dwayne.
Me? Okay.
He was looking at
Yeah.
All right.
he was
All right. I
looking
was
at
looking
me.
at my, Well, typically the psychological contract is an undocumented, unwritten set of expectations and obligations between two parties. Of course, in the case of the workplace, that would be between an employer, which could be represented by a management team, and an employee. And the thing about it is that it parallels with an employment contract in the sense that it sets a set of terms and conditions. However, the major deviance is that the employment contract is a written, signed contract, whereas the psychological contract is quite intangible. It is informal. It is built from the values and the interactions and the cultural interplay in the work relationship between the employer and the employee. So I think that's a major deviance between the two. Yeah.
You're
Hi.
muted.
Yeah, I think you're muted, bro. Okay.
You know, I always muted. I just can't get this right. Okay, so what are some examples of the psychological contract, elements of a psychological contract?
As Dwayne said, is more intangible compared to the legal formal contract. So then it would involve, I suppose, like promises that were made to employees about promotions,
Mhm.
career development opportunities, they're not being fulfilled. So things that are intangible to that nature. I just want to add because I know that most of the persons that perhaps in the community that are listening right now will talk about implied and explicit terms within contracts, and that's completely different because we're looking at it from a more cultural perspective.
Mhm. Thank you. I think that's actually a really important distinction.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that, and I'm going to put this question to you, Maya, as the attorney here. So, which one would you say is most important, or more important rather? The psychological contract, the legal contract, and why?
The legal answer will be it depends. But I want to say this that it I think both are equally important. I think weight has to go to both of them. I don't think that one is more important over the next. I think
Mhm.
when you marry both of them together, that helps with the overall operational excellence of our organization.
Mhm. All
Yeah.
right. Oh, you were going to say something, Dwayne?
Well, I agree. I agree. I think both are equally important, and
Mhm.
I think they have different implications depending on the nature of that contract and the type of breach if it exists.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
So, how does the state of the psychological contract affect employees' mental health and overall well being? So, we know there are different implications. So, what are the implications of the psychological contract?
Okay, no problem. All right. So with any contract, whether it is written, employment based, or which is what we consider to be the traditional, or it is there's a particular breach in the psychological contract, there's always the injury, the
Mm-hmm.
scope of injury and the nature of injury. Now, of course, the injuries differ between the two when there's a breach. For the psychological contract, the injury is more social and psychological.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think it's probably best to kind of display some scenarios in which a psychological contract can be breached. So,
Yeah.
for example, I'm going to give you a few examples. So, one example, let's say you have an employer who, at the stage of recruitment and selection, during the interview stage, you're a candidate and there's this promise that when you come into this job you're going to have training opportunities, a wealth of training opportunities, you're going to have promotional prospects and so on. Once you're performing well, you go into the job 4 5 years, you're actually meeting your side of the contract, because the idea of the psychological contract is there's a transactional nature to it, because here you were getting this job preview at the interview stage that if you do this and you do that, you're going to get these things. But the environment changes. The employer is unable to honor his or her end of the bargain. Now, you can imagine the sense of frustration. So that's one consequence. The sense of a perceived inequity, that you feel that you were in some way hoodwinked at the start of the interview. You said, but you were promised this. So they're failed promises. So there's a broken sense of trust as well. And of course, these things can culminate into other turnover, absenteeism, which are withdrawal behaviors. So effectively, you can have, depending on the personality too, and not just the context of in which the individual finds him or herself, you can have a range of emotional, social, and psychological reactions, even behavioral reactions when there's a breach.
And to add to Dwayne is that we spend most of our working time at work unless we have some trust fund put down. We spend most of our time working, so it really persons kind of like internalize all of these issues, and perhaps can't sleep at night and have all these mental challenges with themselves because at the end of the day some persons put the fact that their job titles as part of their their personalities and so on. So that is where it comes in terms of the mental health aspect of it, and you see a lot in redundancies and on these layoff issues and measures.
And there's something I want to mention too, because there's a level of um, of variance that emerges with a breach in an employment contract versus a psychological contract. Because if you think about it, when there's a breach in an employment contract, because that contract is documented, there's typically a kind of an easier route for legal reparations. So there can be a claim made that this contract was violated, and there's a kind of I think a pathway to recourse. Now the problem with the psychological contract, because it is unwritten, it is informal, is intangible. That is something that is almost like a social psychological relationship. When that is breached, an employer has a bit more protection, especially within the legal space. And then what that does for the individual, it kind of disadvantages, or I think it places the individual, usually the employee, who's at the shorter end of the stick, in a disadvantaged position to get the needed reparations, because these terms and conditions in the contract of the psychological contract are not documented. So how do we gain accountability, or how do we pursue accountability for the employer, or on behalf of the employer, to ensure that those particular injuries and breaches are actually repaired? And that's much more difficult because, as you know, things change, and when when things are verbal and things are like unwritten, is very, very difficult to prove violation, and of course have a pathway for repair. Yeah. So accountability is much more difficult to prove, or at least to simulate.
Okay. Oh, sorry, you were going to say something.
So that's it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I know that, and I'm no legal expert here. So I know that sometimes people talk about like verbal contracts. So somebody says something, like makes a promise to you, and even though it's not written, it can be enforced. So I know there's the harder route, like you mentioned, Dwayne, but then I think about even within the psychological contract, you can tell me if this falls within this context. There are times that an employer does not necessarily make a promise, but there is a culture within the organization that lends to a certain type of behavior or certain expectations, or so how does that play out? How does culture link to the psychological contract within the organization, even when it's not something that's explicitly said?
Yeah, well, I think that's the very function and substance of the psychological contract. It is reinforced by the said culture, because culture, like the psychological contract, is equally intangible. And as cultures change, one would imagine that there will be changes or an evolution pathway for a psychological contract, because you can start an organization, let's say, where it was a friendly, it was trust filled, and the psychological contract looks different in that kind of culture. But let's say there's a change in leadership, and he or she comes in with a different behavior, toxic, creates a hostile work environment. Now, there is that breach that happens because the culture, remember, is now shook. It is now upended, and it creates this kind of rift between what was the status quo before and now what this leadership is trying to do, which is different. Now, over time, because cultures evolve over time, you would perhaps find a shift in psychological contract where you would find people might just say, I'm just going to do the minimum because this organization does not respect me. So the terms of condition, the expectations now, that unwritten set of expectations changes because the culture changed over time, and then it's like it sets the norms, the standards of behaviors and interactions.
Yeah, as Dwayne was saying, I was thinking of this legal concept, and this is where I guess the law and management, the interplay happens, because like it happens a lot in the public sector space. There's this particular concept called legitimate expectation. So many
Mhm.
public sector officers will perhaps go to university or go to law school, and they're expecting that when they choose to pursue those particular educational pursuits, that they have that opportunity to do them, because that is the legitimate expectation that has been created within the organization. And sometimes that doesn't happen, again, because of changes in management, and perhaps just organizational restructuring. And that's where the interplay comes in.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
Connectivity.
yeah.
All right, so give me 1 second. All right, so thank you. Let me get back to our questions. All right, so what are some of the effective ways that employers can build and maintain? Actually, before we even get into that, let's talk about trust and the psychological contract and how that is. All right, so give
Just
me.
life is just life for you today, Ron.
I feel like every single time I do this, I am in some way embarrassed. I in some way
Don't
embarrass myself,
don't
but
be,
anyway, I'm just going to, keep plodding on and doing my
as you
best
should, as you
to,
should.
bring quality conversation despite of the technical difficulties. All right, so let's talk about trust and the
Mhm.
psychological contract and the relationship between trust and the psychological contract. Anybody?
Okay,
Okay,
I was
I'll jump in.
say,
Well, no, Maya, you go first. That'll
I
be
was
helpful.
only going to say that before we get to trust, I think that we need to create a space of vulnerability first, before we even get to trust. And I mean it in the most professional context. So, like for example, you have more junior staff maybe joining your team, and obviously they may have different ideas because they may be younger than their counterparts within the organization. To me, creating a space and allowing these persons to share their views and their ideas in a very respectful manner is important. That's how you create the trust. Another area could be on a personal level. We are human beings, in as much as we're in a professional setting and we have to work with others and meet deadlines and targets. But again, life is life, and just like how we had the connectivity issues, and persons may lose a family member, they may have some personal issue going on, and approaching that person was on a human level can create and foster that trust. But first you must have created the space of vulnerability. Per employee should feel comfortable enough to come and speak without reprisal or without their information being given to others. Confidentiality being honored. All these issues are
Mhm.
important to creating trust in the workplace and among
Yeah,
teams.
I think that's an amazing point,
excellent.
Dwayne.
No, I mean, Maya actually hit the nail on the head.
Mhm.
Uh, but building trust, maintaining trust, these activities, trust building activities, are all critical in ensuring that the psychological contract and, of course, the expectations and obligations within are actually maintained. And if you think about it, it's a reciprocal relationship between trust and the psychological contract, in the sense that when the psychological contract and the contents of which are maintained and respected, then trust grows.
Mhm.
Vice on the opposite side, when you break trust, it automatically translates to a breaking of the same psychological contract. And
Mhm.
I keep reminding people that trust is all about being consistent, and that's why communication is so important. Because I mean, if you think about the nature of a psychological contract, a breach happens when one side does not honor his or her promises, or the expectations on the other side. And
Mhm.
typically it may not be intentional. Things
Yeah.
may change, as Maya highlighted. The environment changed, the organization hit a financial rut, and has to restructure. So the promotion that you were promised, even
Yeah.
at least verbally, or there was this expectation that was created at the interview stage, if you go to your employees and you are genuine, you're sincere, you keep your communication lines open and honest, you can help shape the management and the shifting of those expectations, because that's all it really needs to go back to employees. But what I've found that employers seldom go back to employees in the case of a psychological contract violation, to kind of indicate why there was such a breach, and of course to make some amends, to ensure that they can repair that loss.
I actually would like to have your thoughts on something on the conversation of trust, because recently I watched a lecture from this, I can't remember, a professor, first name Erin, and from France. And she was talking about employers building trust with employees, and having to make decisions on a day-to-day basis about how transparent to be with your employees. And one of the examples she gave was, say, for example, you knew that there was the possibility of restructuring and persons may have to go home. Do you tell your employees beforehand and let them know, okay, this thing may be coming, and risk them leaving the company to protect themselves financially? Or do you say, okay, I'll wait to see if something happens and then tell them, okay, I'm sorry that this has to happen, but we have to restructure, because there are implications for both.
True.
So employers have to manage the best interest of the organization on the one hand, but also that trust that they're building with the employees. So in a case like that, what do you think would be the best way to approach it, if there is a best way to approach it?
Yeah,
Because
good
it's easy and
industrial
difficult to
practice.
say.
Yeah, but it's really a delicate line to to balance, because good industrial practice, to my mind, would say, especially in situations of mergers and layoffs, how we had the pandemic, those lines of communication would be important. You have team meetings, you let them know how the organization is performing. You may not have to go into specific details, but employees deserve that. They deserve to know exactly the pulse of the organization, what is happening. If we have to go in this particular direction, you let them know. You don't wait. I know of a client who is afraid in an organization, because when Friday comes and they hear the HR calling, it could be a possibility. That's not a good way
Mhm.
to be working. That's not a good working environment, to be quite frank. You have to be open, as painful as it is. And I think that employers can, employ those particular kind of strategies, especially when they're dealing with difficult issues like this. And of course, employees too will have is a two-way street, because employees would have to appreciate, that life happens and there are always changes in the environment that affect businesses and how they operate. And so, they are the opportunity that I know that many persons throughout the pandemic and post-pandemic, they're entrepreneurs, and they will never go back to working 9 to 5s
Mhm.
because they had to be very resilient. Some have gone back into the working world, but they have side hustles, so they learn to be resilient. They appreciate, all these nuances within the workplace. But I think that it requires, as Dwayne says, I like to say, clear, consistent communication. No one should be left in the dark.
Okay. Anything to add, Dwayne, or?
No, I think Maya actually touched that question quite nicely. That was.
Mhm. So I'm not seeing any comments so far. Audience, I know that sometimes I don't get all of your questions. So if I haven't gotten your questions, I apologize. But nevertheless, we move on. So let's talk about some, sorry, let's talk about what employers can do when the psychological contract has been breached. Actually, let's back up.
Mhm.
Let's talk about how they can protect themselves from from breaches of psychological contract. We talked about clear communication being one of them, but then also, if it happens, how can employers regain that trust?
Okay. Yeah. I can probably begin here. I think if you think about any time trust is broken, what do you think is the first thing that has to be done? And I think it's acknowledging that there's been a breach.
Yeah.
You're in a relationship with your partner, and there was something that was a breach of that marital or relationship contract. You step out of the relationship example. The first step in repairing that trust is recognizing and admitting that a breach has occurred. Because, and why this is so important in the employment context, remember, the psychological contract is unwritten. And for employer or manager to come and say, you know what, I dropped the ball there, that signals to an employee a level of sincerity, because he or she can easily evade that accountability because of the unwritten rules and expectations inherent in the psychological contract. And so, in a violation, I always say the first thing you do, you acknowledge the breach and discuss it with the victim. Well, I refer to it as the victim, but the target of the breach, the employee or employees, apologize and explain what went wrong. Because think about it, in many cases, it may not be, as I said before, deliberate or intentional. It may be, as Maya said, something that was outside of the control in the wider environment that the employer had, no influence, and work as reasonably as you can to arrive at alternative solutions. And if you think about it, this is no different from if in a service industry, let's say something happened to a customer was food poisoned because they bought a roti. Businesses usually reach out, acknowledge it, they try to make reparations or amends and make amends to the situation. And that is all in an effort to recover that service failure. So in the same way, for that recovery to happen, you also have to involve the employee in discussions as much as you can, as willing as employee could be, to repair through new collaborative solutions or middle ground solutions.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned, seeking recourse and coming up with solutions, because often people think it's okay to just apologize and I need to
Yeah.
ask your apology. And it's like, okay, so you apologize for like messing me up or whatever. So what are you gonna do about it? Or like, how does that benefit me? Like, what weight does that apology carry? And I think a lot of people, whether it be in personal or professional relationships need to understand that beyond the apology, there needs to be, wherever possible, some kind of work to demonstrate that you're actually really sorry, because an apology is really easy for some people to communicate. Like, I'm sorry.
In any relationship.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's just move on. Yeah, right. And it really doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
So I thought that that was actually really important, because the other thing, and I think that the example we gave was brilliant about service recovery, because we do, well, not in all cultures, and I don't want to single out any particular culture like Barbados or anything, but
Say less. Say less.
yeah, but I think that very often the the organization may feel like, okay, well, this is a customer, they add value in terms of business, so this is my bread and butter, let me try to apologize to people, let me make amends. That's if they're really serious about business. But very often they see the employee as disposable. Okay, there are a lot of people looking for jobs, but that in itself um, also affects the mental health, not only of the person who is, as Dwayne would say, is the target of the breach, but also other people in the organization who are looking on. So we want to create an organizational culture of healthy communication. We want to create an organizational culture of accountability, transparency. I mean, that's what I'm hearing you saying. Is there anything else that you would like to add to that?
And vulnerability, of course, within context.
Yes, within context. So Maya, are you saying not to cry at work? Is that what you're saying? Okay, I'm just kidding. I don't want to be in
No.
trouble.
Yeah, but I mean,
So
adjacent to that, sorry, I mean, adjacent to Maya's response about
uh,
having that kind of safe environment. I call it a safe environment where you can
yeah.
be vulnerable. And something adjacent to that is the fact that you don't feel that when you make a mistake as an employee, that you are hit hard. Uh,
Yeah.
you have to be able to create a culture where people learn from their mistakes. Because if people are fearful that when they that if they make a mistake, that there's significant or serious consequences, no matter the scale or the nature of the mistake, people will be disinclined to take healthy risks, to be innovative. So it's so important that you create that culture for learning and culture for trial and error, and
Hmm.
not quickly punish if there are
Hmm.
missteps.
Okay, cool. I love that. So, in what ways can we include or involve employees in decision making processes to strengthen the psychological contract?
Right, but if you look at it from the change management perspective, so for example, there's a new policy that you would like to implement within the organization or across a particular team. You as the boss will not come to everybody and be like, yeah, we're doing this here tomorrow. I as the boss, I say this here, and nobody can say nothing else. Poor, extremely poor. Before you implement any change, you will be met with some persons who are going to be resistant. Barbadians, culturally speaking, are known to be ones who are very resistant to change, and we have to take that into account. It's people in our society before long. They're people that we're dealing with. And if you're going to implement changes because of different environmental factors that affect your business, that's a nuanced issue, and we all appreciate it as adults. You have to come to persons and speak to them, have that communication, involve them in the process, within your teams. Speak to them, let them know what's happening with this particular implementation, the reasons behind it. People will be more inclined to want to know, the buy into it. So that's important. That's
Yeah,
one important way when we're looking at incorporating repairing trust and for team members.
yeah, yeah. And to add to Maya's point about the importance of buy-in, especially through involving employees. I think too often in the Caribbean, not just peculiar to Barbados, that we tend to have this belief. And when I say we, you have those at senior management, whether you're in the public sector or private sector, you stay in your particular ivory rooms, you make the policies, and then you just foist those policies onto the employees and expect them to be owned jointly. And I tell people that that's not how you get shared ownership. Because what you find is that when you just foist a policy or program or intervention on an employee, the employee sees it as yours and not and doesn't identify with it. So one of the better ways of getting that shared ownership is involving employees very early in the processes. Now, let's be practical. Not every program or policy or initiative an employee or set of employees might be fully involved at every stage of conception and design, and but identifying areas in which employees can provide that input, and not just providing input, because I've seen where people have when I say people, employers have these employee suggestion boxes and they're just filling up, but it's just creating a sense of involvement, but it's not really genuine involvement, because who reads those suggestions? But if you can come out and say, look, I'm going to pull some suggestions, and you tell employees, these suggestions, we're going to run them this week. That to me provides a heavier sense of involvement. Not that just that I'm being listened to, but at least my feedback is being considered to some level or to some scale. Yeah.
Don't just shoot down ideas like that.
Yeah.
Allow persons to be able to make their full submissions on, why they believe that this change may not be correct. Everybody has a way.
Well, I mean, what's interesting, hold on, can you all hear all of that noise in the background? Okay.
Partially, yeah.
Yeah.
It's gone. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, interestingly, when you spoke about involving employees, I thought about participant readiness, which is something we talk a lot about in marketing. And, when I think about the workplace, a lot of times we try to involve employees in processes that they're really not that interested in. Do you think that the Caribbean culture is one where the average lane employee is interested in being a part of these decision-making processes? And if so, if not, what do you think that is? Is it because the work environments do not allow for readiness or don't foster or encourage participant interest, or is it just cultural?
Okay, so I'll answer that question because that's a quite nuanced question. So the drivers of interest among employees who may want to be involved or who prefer not to be involved could very well be cultural, in the sense it's almost like a chicken and egg scenario. Those employees might not be interested because they have been in a culture for a long time that has never recognized and rewarded involvement. So it's something that is foreign to them. So when imagine that you were in an organization for 20 years, you're in the public service, and all of a sudden they bring in this new PS who's so passionate about innovation and involving people. That is something that is going to run strange to you, because you'll be looking at this individual and say, but because all of that, remember, the culture shapes our expectations and our beliefs of what our value is as an employee, and what our particular roles are versus what the management roles are. So you'll have that problem where you have a culture that may be a driver. Now, on the other side, you can have a situation where interest might very well not be there because employees are not fully prepared or educated. A perfect example is in succession planning. I speak about this a lot. You have a situation where you have an older, more senior head who's about to retire. An individual is earmarked just below that individual to take on that role. But that individual is never prepared with the training, the mentorship to take on that role sufficiently and competently, and then ended up and they end up being a square peg in a round hole. And I think that that's where square pegs in a round hole actually comes from, because you can have an employee who's a very proficient employee, a square peg in a square hole, but
Mhm.
moving out into a leadership role with little or no preparation, that role is a round role. So that employee is not rounded. I like to use the metaphor sufficiently rounded to fit within that round space. And I think that is also a critical point in terms of where a lot of employees might shy away, or move away from or be disinclined to take on those involvement opportunities because they feel like they might not be adequate, or it's almost like an imposter syndrome. I don't know if I have the skills to do it. And that's why I keep telling people that to promote involvement, you have to educate, you have to make sure your employees are trained, that their confidence is there, and then you will see that natural segue.
Mhm. It reminds me of when I was in New Zealand. I was sitting on one of my PhD supervisor's classes. He taught intercultural communication, and the class was full of Asian students. And he would ask questions, and nobody answered. He would say, "Okay, talk to your neighbor and discuss something," and they would not discuss it. I would actually have to like turn to somebody, and I remember I'm not in the class, I'm just observing, and start to engage somebody. And he told me that he actually in his first time teaching the class, he got a really poor review because the Asian students are used to being told all the
Yeah.
answers, right? And so for them, they're like, "You're the teacher. Like, why are you asking me questions? You should be telling me what to do." And
Cultural. Mm.
yes, so very cultural. And when you even, think about that kind of scenario in an organization, you can see how it could affect the employees again if they do not expect that they're supposed to be operating in that manner. It can affect the manager or supervisor who is frustrated about the lack of participant interest or participation. And it's just really about um, getting everybody on the same page or acquainted. So I think even before we start to involve employees in decision making, we need to know like who they are,
Mm.
right? To
Mm.
get a sense of culture, but also personalities, and know who you can pull in to do certain things, and be very transparent about why you're involving a particular person in a particular kind of activity. Because what can sometimes happen too is if you call on the same person all the time,
There we go.
exactly, people are like, this body's a favorite, blah blah blah, and
Yeah.
stress again. So it's such a delicate thing. Mental health is just so complicated.
As you were talking, I was even thinking about this whole concept of performance punishment. So, performance punishment is when you have a good employee or a few good employees
Yeah,
they meet the deadlines, they do high quality work, but guess what? They're rewarded with more and more work.
yeah,
And it is unfortunate because I guess you can say it from the management perspective that these are people that you can trust, that you can put your confidence in to fulfill the task. However, it shows a lack of awareness, situational awareness, in the sense that you might be overburdening these persons by giving them more and more work and expecting the same quality of output. And
mhm,
so when you were talking about, you give work to these people, and others are looking on, but the others who are looking on and talking about, these are brown nosers and so on, they don't know the kind of stress and strain that the good employees, so good employees tend to be turned to bad employees because they say, well, because I'm getting all of this performance punishment, let me take a
true.
few steps back and join the rest of
Mhm,
mediocrity. I'll stay in that particular zone. Yeah.
mhm.
Those are markers for certain professions, like my profession.
Wow.
Um,
Yes, definitely.
that's very interesting.
Markers of success.
Mm.
You get
You
more
mean
work.
doing the okay,
Yeah. Being a good employee, being
okay.
rewarded. And that's a cultural thing, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
interesting.
as nuanced to particular industries.
Okay, we have a comment finally. Hey. Okay, Dogmatic Rep, thanks for being with us. All right, so overworking good employees never allow inefficient ones to improve.
Yeah,
That's so true.
another adjacent consequence. Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah, that is so true.
yeah. Because they get all of the opportunities, and those inefficient ones remain in where they are at the stage, and it's this kind of stagnation that happens, in their zone, and you know,
That's the psychological breach that we speak about, that intangible aspect to it,
Mhm.
because that person feels inadequate. And really and truly, that's not the case. It's just that they're not being stretched and growing in the way that they need to, because they're not given those opportunities. It's a very personalized approach that you have to take. And as a leader, that's a very, very heavy responsibility, very
yeah,
heavy onus on you.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And I would like to even intervene the whole subject of praise and recognition, Rowan. The notion that there are two types of acknowledgement or praise for employees. You can give them private or public praise. Private praise is where you pull aside an employee who's done a very good job and say, you know what, you did a very good job there, man. Thank you for what you did there. And that is a lot. There's a lot of, and especially if it's done sufficiently sincere, I think that hits home to the heart of an employee to say, I was pulled aside privately and told, or even a private thank you note from a supervisor can go a long way in making an employee feel so appreciated. And then there's the public praise, because there's some employees that prefer the public praise. Where I remember a friend of mine who works at Sagicor, he got his CFA, and Sagicor took out a full page ad, just recognizing and celebrating and commending the output that he's gained, and how Sajagora, really appreciates his efforts. And that sent volumes to him,
Mhm.
in terms of the level of sincerity and appreciation. So I think we have to do a better job, I think, as in managers and employers, to praise, to give recognition. I remember years in my 20s, years ago, I was given the same subject, some ventilation in the organization. And the employer told me, from an old school mentality, I am not going to give any thank yous. What they want thank you for, they're already getting paid for it.
Oh my God.
And that's the kind of mentality that you face
Oh
in the,
my goodness.
the compensation is sufficient, the remuneration. That's
Yeah.
to getting all this. What thank you what?
Anyway, well, that was like 15 years ago.
Yeah, we hope that that's a dying
Yeah,
breed.
that's
Yeah,
all. That's
yeah,
all.
that's a declining breed.
Yeah. Yeah. Not Diane, declining.
Declining.
Yeah.
Yes, metaphorically.
All right. So I actually got a note on my phone. Somebody sent a comment on LinkedIn saying, spot on, Dwayne. So somebody's showing some love for your comment. Arlene Estwick. Yeah, I don't know why it's not coming through on here.
Okay.
But yeah, that happens sometimes. Okay, thank you, guys. All right, so we're kind of wrapping up.
Mm.
What kind of support systems do you think organizations should put in place to ensure that the mental health or the mental well-being of the employees are the mental health is preserved or mental well-being is preserved?
I know, like from the professional services perspective, those who have the opportunity to work in the normal brick and mortar and then obviously in the hybrid models, you have a lot of isolation, especially when you're working in the remote working at times. I know when I first started out in law, that was the issue, because we call the 2020 attorneys that were called the bar the pandemic lawyers, and many of them were not able to really like interact with the other persons in the bar and even in the workplaces. And I felt that that was showed high levels of isolation and sometimes depression, because you're not having that human connection. You're not being able to actually going to have lunch and learns and coffee over chats with other team members and pretty much growing together. And I figured that, even though we've moved past the pandemic and the working structures have changed, that within the professional services, we could at least always meet up physically at least have like 3 days out of the week that we meet up and have that human interaction, where we get learning and development going. We actually get to communicate with other team members and build relationships and bonds. I think that helps with your overall mental health.
3 days a week is a lot, Maya. I'm just
Yeah, it is. I'm thinking about two, to be quite frank, but I'm just trying to be
saying.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with Maya. Having those kinds of opportunities and initiatives are important. I think also that um, employers have to be able to have accessible programs for employees who are going through significant strain. We talk a lot about these employment assistance or employee assistance programs.
Mhm.
And I'm happy to see a lot more organizations tapping into these services to make them accessible to
Yeah.
their employees. But I have a caution when these services are procured that you have to ensure in the entire process that there's confidentiality, that trust cannot be broken, because I've done reviews with some of these employee assistance programs, and the number one reason that they don't work is that a lot of employees don't trust them. They don't trust that when they confide, even though that the service provider is independent in the sense of the employer, a lot of employees, I guess, again, this is cultural, are quite disinclined. They're not minded to share or even use the services, far less share critically sensitive information about their
Mhm.
with these professionals. So it really is about creating that environment of trust.
Well, I mean, if it helps anybody, and I can't say that this is the case for everyone, but I know that when I engaged one of those services years ago, how it was set up was that the counseling services did not actually name the employee.
Mm,
Actually, I wasn't even an employee; I was a relative of an employee,
mm,
and but they were providing that service. And so the employee's name was not even put forward. There was actually just a list. So they
mm.
knew, okay, this amount of people came to us, and then they paid for the service or whatever. So there are some of those measures put in place, and those are the kind of things that you can ask. You can ask about the levels of confidentiality or the methods put in place to
Yeah.
preserve confidentiality, instead of just saying, I'm not doing this at all.
Yeah.
But again, it requires a certain level of vulnerability, um,
True.
individual vulnerability. But I mean, I
But
believe counseling.
but even in that case, I mean, and in that case, the employer has to be more proactive too. I mean,
yeah. I was just
because
going to
for
go
them
there.
to ask, yeah, for them to kind of think about the fact that okay, employees will be asking these questions, they might not be inclined to ask the questions, so they may have to be more proactive to go out there and say and sell the service, sell the fact that this is a highly confidential service, as you said, Rohan, that these are the measures in place. So communication, proactive communication, to me is going to be vital.
Well, I guess that's really interesting because I wasn't even thinking about going to the employer themselves. I was thinking about finding out from the actual counseling service, like what measures are put in place on their end. Because I wasn't working at the place per
Mhm.
se, I don't know if my relative actually. I don't think she had to actually go in and say I have somebody coming in. I think she just had to contact the counseling services.
Yeah, self-referral.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I don't know that in every case you even have to go through your employer. I think what the employer needs to do is to let people know that this
There,
is available, you
right.
know,
Yeah.
and because even if an employer says it is highly confidential, you don't want to go to your HR manager in many cases and say, okay, I need these services,
Mhm.
because it's that's still kind of close to home and there's still some kind of implications.
Mhm.
um, Persons will wonder if you're able to function at work, if you're going through something, that kind of thing. So if there's a possibility of you going directly to these services, I think that's
Yeah.
ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Maya, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I totally agree. Didn't have the experience of that. I wish that these assistant programs could assist also too with the transitioning when there are layoffs and restructuring as well. I know it happens a lot in international spaces because of course they have more resources, but I think that it could help. It could benefit those employees who are transitioning from employment to perhaps entrepreneurship and getting themselves in a new job or whatever the case may be, because those are very emotional time periods for persons,
Yeah,
to be quite frank.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So our final question is: when we think about trends, is there anything that you're seeing out there, um, whether it be locally or internationally, about how organizations are addressing mental health and trust and the psychological contract?
Yes, mental health days. I'm seeing that that's a new trend in certain organizations.
Mental health,
A mental health day. Not what
mental.
casting. What casting's about.
What? Who sings it? Well,
Cass, if you're familiar with Cass, I love Cass.
well, Cass, Cass. Okay, I
Yes.
know Cass.
What
I don't
Cass
know.
sings
I
about.
don't know that song. I don't know that
But
song.
what Cass sings
I'm
about.
not up to the times.
Yes.
Mhm.
More and more employers are actually implementing that within their organizations. I
Mhm.
mean, I
I
know that
said,
it has a lot of challenge from the older counterparts. They will tell you that they never had their grandparents never had a mental health day. My dad would tell me that when they were working in the field. But I know that long are the days where mental health is no longer a taboo topic. And post COVID, it's been very critical within the working space.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's great because, as far as I'm concerned, like if I need a mental health day, that's a sick day because my mental
yeah.
part of me and my wellness.
Very
So
true.
it is going to happen regardless.
It is, and again, this is where law meets the management style, because I've seen a case already where this guy had lost an actual employee. He had his aunt. This lady, he called her his aunt, but she wasn't really blood related, and he came to work, and then something happened. He was at work in a daze. He wasn't fully attentive to his duties, and then he wound up in a disciplinary hearing. So yeah, that's where the law and our mental health really intersect. So I think that that's important.
Yes.
That's a
Yeah,
real piece.
All
yeah. I
right.
think I think for me, my last point really is, in by way of trends that I've been observing, the Gen Z versus baby boomer. Um, I think that dynamic is going to be an important one when it comes to the psychological contract. We know that Gen Zs relative to baby boomers are, when they go into organizations, they're going in to seek quick career progression. They want a lot of opportunities, and if they don't get that, they're quick to move. I think Rohan, but Maya, you're
I'm
probably
trying to
familiar
tell
with that
you.
kind of behavior.
I'm telling you.
Yeah,
Pivot,
so
it's a
imagine
whole different
psychological
career.
contract looks, yeah, correct, yeah, because psychological contract looks totally different for Gen Z relative to baby boomer, who, if you think about it, were the ones who actually lionize things like loyalty to the organization.
Oh
Gen
yeah.
Zs are not about, loyalty. This is not loyalty because they've seen what their grandparents and parents went
Oh
through
yeah.
and how disloyal organizations were. They were quick to
Sure
cut.
bet.
So they're just going through the system. And I think the other thing that is going to be different between Gen Zs and baby boomers is that a baby boomer can wait for an entire year to get an annual performance review.
Mm-hmm.
Gen Zs, however, they like that consistent feedback flow.
Mm-hmm.
They want to get feedback on your performance. They want to be able to make changes quickly. So it's always is about the pace.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things would affect, the things like HR processes and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Any final comments from any of you before we wrap up? Including letting us know where we can find you.
All the socials, Twitter, Instagram. I'm a millennial, so all the socials. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, my
And
Kellman,
what do we search for, Maya? We search for Maya
my
Kellman or
Kellman,
MLK
yes.
or
MLK
MLK?
Legal Consultancy.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you can find me at Dwayne.Devonish at capehill.ue.edu. I'm at Capehill, so if you're anywhere in the vicinity, you can reach out to me. You have my email address. My socials are pretty open in terms of Facebook. I'm an older millennial, so I'm on the Facebook.
Yeah.
There's
Dwayne
no
Dev
such thing
I'm
as
also
an
on
older
Instagram.
millennial. There's no
Yeah,
such thing.
yeah.
There is such a thing as an older millennial because
Ron, you I know
All
you
right.
want to buy him up. You can back him up all you want.
I am older than Dwayne. Like
Sure, I
I am,
guess we're both on the same side. We're on the
I'm
same team.
older millennial. Like I totally
Yeah,
get it. Totally get it. So yeah. Okay, cool. So I put up their names on the screen. Thank you so much, guys, for being here and for sharing with us. This was a really good conversation, and I look forward to having you back. I know Dwayne coming back for sure.
yeah. I'm
Maya,
looking forward to it.
you'll
Yeah,
be
certainly. I love to have a good chat. Yes.
perfect. Me too. All right. So
Thank
thanks,
you.
audience, so much for being here. We appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Bye.
Thank you, Rowan.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye.
Cheers, man.